Have you ever looked at seam allowances and just wondered, why is everything 5/8? Or why does this pattern have 3/8? So in this video, I'm going to talk about seam allowances, why they seem to be the same, why your commercial patterns might be different than what you see on garments that you buy in the store, and how you can choose your own seam allowances for what you want in your own sewing. Welcome back, my dear sewing friends. It is lovely to see your smiling faces again. Welcome. If we are just meeting for the first time, my name's Evelyn Wood and I'm the creator of VintageSewingSchool.com, and here on this channel we talk about everything garment sewing so that you can get better and improve your garments that you make too. So do hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Double check down below because sometimes YouTube likes to trick you on that. So this question actually came up in Vintage Sewing School for our monthly Q&A, and I then also saw it appear in the comments here on YouTube. And so when things happen like that, you know it's something, a topic that needs to be discussed. So the main questions here are, why is 5/8 seam allowance used, or 1.5 centimeters? Why is that the main one? It seems a bit bulky sometimes. Can I choose a different seam allowances? Why do some have 3/8 and some have 5/8? And why do the clothes that I buy seem to have smaller seam allowances than what's on commercial patterns? Can I change the seam allowance? Is this a thing? So this is the main sort of questions I think we all have running through our head when we start to realize and think for ourselves in sewing. I remember having these questions myself, being really confused as to why different patterns had different amounts of seam allowances, what they were good for, what different amounts were good for. It wasn't really until I started looking at pattern drafting, and this then obviously you're actually making changes to the patterns that you understand why you have different amounts for different parts, and obviously then how you can choose for yourself to make your own patterns according to your own preference with what you want to do. So let's cover off a few topics first. We're going to why you have 5/8, why there's less, why your store-made garments might have a certain amount compared to commercial patterns, what seam allowances are good for different areas, and how you can choose that as well. So let's start though with why most commercial patterns have 5/8 or 1.5 centimeter seam allowances. I think there's a few good reasons here. So 5/8 of seam allowance gives us a lot of room here. And traditionally, sew-at-home patterns were mostly only done with wovens because that was really the only fabric once upon a time that was sewn at home. And so woven fabrics do require a bit more seam allowance, and we'll cover more on that in a minute. But 5/8 gives you enough room on your garment here that you have structure, because woven fabric, as you know, frays. So we need to allow for that. You need to have a good chunk of seam allowance there so that it doesn't fray out on you. 5/8 gives you that. Also the 1.5 centimeter, 5/8 and 1.5 centimeter, same thing by the way, is that you can then also choose whatever seam finish that you want to do. So you could have an overlocked or serge seam. You have enough to either turn and stitch. You could do a felled seam, a French seam. You can basically, 5/8 gives you enough seam allowance to do whatever seam finish that you want. And it also allows you a little bit of extra room for fit, for adjustments, room for error as you're sewing garments together. So it also allows for that. And I must say, why do they have 5/8 on the entire pattern all over? Well, could you imagine how hard it would be if different areas on the pattern had different seam allowances as well when you're starting to just learning how to sew? It would be a nightmare because you would always forget. So I can definitely understand why they just do the one seam allowance over the entire pattern, because it just makes it so much easier when you pick it up and you're learning, just getting used to it. But as you get better at your sewing and you start to really kind of improve and understand why all these things are, you can start to choose what seam allowance and make your own patterns with the seam allowances that you want on there. And now the big question is, why do off-the-rack garments that you buy often have much smaller seam allowances than what we're supposed to do on a commercial pattern? This one, in my experience, is really only down to the manufacturer keeping costs down, really, for mass-produced garments. So the way that most, I'm going to just pull out a number here, 95% of garments are made that you buy just in any stores, they're made, the seam is sewn and it is overlocked or serged at the same time on the one machine. So it'll either have a 4 or a 5 thread function made up on it. So it will do the one chain single row of stitches, like your straight stitch, and it will overlock all in one. That's why they're closed, is because they do it on one machine. And so obviously it's set to a set amount, and that's what they use. Also, any tiny little amount, when you're making up in like garment manufacture, they would do layers and layers. They could have hundreds of layers of fabric, like this thick fabric, and they cut out all together in one. And so what you call like your layout is called a marker in industry. So how all your pattern pieces all puzzle together on that. Every centimeter counts when you've got 100 layers down here, every centimeter that you can save. So just by having a little bit less seam allowance means you can just squeeze in the patterns a little bit more and use a little less fabric. It saves costs as well. And so that's really the only reason why your ready-made garments have a different amount or look a little bit different. It's just due to mass manufacturing. When they're doing it in bulk, it's using it on the machines, but we don't have those machines, and we can choose to do something that's a little bit neater, nicer, and will give us more couture, higher end finishes, of course, as well. And so the real question is, can you choose to have a different amount of seam allowance? Yes, you can. Of course you can. So even if your pattern has 5/8 seam allowance on there, you can choose to have a different amount. There's 2 different ways that you could go about it. Let's first of all talk about what are good amounts of seam allowances for different areas and different things and different fabrics. So let's start with woven fabrics. Now, I like a 5/8 or 1.5 centimeter seam allowance for woven fabrics because of all the reasons that I basically talked about in the first point above. It gives you all the room that you need for a nice, decent seam allowance. You can choose any seam finish, all of those things. But the different areas on the pattern are what I choose differently. So let's have a look at a bodice, for example. So I use 5/8 or 1.5 centimeter everywhere on my patterns, except for necklines. So necklines, even though this one is marked at 1.5, I know, because it is incomplete pattern, not yet. I like to have a 1 centimeter or 3/8 seam allowance on my necklines. And I mark that and I make that on my pattern, which we'll do in a minute. So why? Is because necklines are always curved and you need a smaller amount. You think about the last pattern you did. I bet it told you to trim back. You need to grade your seam or trim back your seam allowances around the curve of a neckline like that, right? I'm basically doing that on my pattern so I don't have to trim off any of my back stitching on my shoulder seams or anything like this. I find that the 1 centimeter or 3/8 is just enough that I can work with, but not too much that it's bulky. I can clip it and it doesn't cause any problems. I like that amount. So that is what I make on my patterns for my necklines. Everywhere else is 5/8. And so you might find the same thing. But let's talk about knits, because knits really, 5/8 of a seam allowance, 1.5 centimeter, is a bit bulky. Yeah, it is. So generally on knitwear, you'll probably want something a little less, because knits in general, the fabric is a bit thicker, and so all these seams become a bit bulkier. And knitwear doesn't fray, so you actually don't need the extra room for sort of stability and strength in the seam, because it's not going to fray out on you, so you can get away with having a little bit less. I like to use about 3/8 or 1 centimeter on knitwear. But the thing is, you might find some patterns actually have that already included and will only have a smaller amount because they are thinking that you're going to use an overlocker or a serger to sew your seams with, which is quite common, of course. And so when you do that, you sew your overlocking, you'll finish your edge with that overlocking, that serged edge, and it will sew your straight stitch in one with a 4-thread function. It's really, really great. And so you can just trim off a little bit as you go. You're always looking at the stitch line. That is the part that stays there all of the time, and trim it off. So what do I do with knitwear with my patterns? Well, I generally still have a 5/8 seam allowance on my patterns, except for necklines. I use the 1 centimeter or 3/8, because then I know every pattern I make, that's just my standard rule. I don't have to think about it. I know what the seam allowances are all going to be, and it makes it really easy for my workflow. Because I'm usually either serging or doing some kind of seam allowance like this, I will trim off the excess when I'm sewing my seam, and then that is how I get my 3/8 seam allowance, even though on my pattern it is 5/8, right? So how can you start changing your patterns to actually have a different amount of seam allowance than specified? Now that you're a little bit more aware of the different areas and different types of functions that they might have, you can start choosing. As a more experienced, really creative dressmaker, you can choose your own. So how do you do this? Well, you don't just sew a smaller seam allowance. No. So let's say your pattern has 5/8 like this, and you want to make your neckline with 3/8 or 1 centimeter instead. So you don't just sew it smaller, because remember, these pattern pieces are like puzzle pieces. They've all been mathematically worked out to fit together perfectly. So what you need to do is to first of all draw in your stitch line. So pencil in how much seam allowance is on your pattern already so you can see the stitch line. And then you can measure out your new seam allowance all the way in, say, let's for example, 1 centimeter or 3/8, and then trim off that seam allowance afterwards. Because what's on seam allowance on your pattern is kind of like dead space. You can alter that and it doesn't alter the fit of the garment, so long as you remember to keep your stitch line exactly the same, and you will have no problems. I know this information can be a lot to take in sometimes, particularly if you haven't really made up many patterns yet. This can be a bit overwhelming, but trust me, this makes a bit more sense when you've made up a few garments and you're really starting to notice the seam allowance and amounts. Then this information is at the right point for you to click and to really start going beyond what you see on a pattern and deciding for yourself what you want to do in your sewing, because I want you to make all of those great garments that you dream of. And trust me, you absolutely can. All it takes is a little guidance, a lot of practice, but you can absolutely do it. I share all of these types of tips and more, and actually how to do all these things, obviously, in my online sewing school, Vintage Sewing School. There's links down below because I would love to have you in class. Now, tell me, my friends, what is your preferred seam allowance for different places on your patterns? Do you like smaller ones for necklines like I do? Knitwear versus wovens. I'd love to hear your experience, because it's how we can all get better at our own sewing by sharing our tips. Okay, my sewing friends, happy sewing. Do check the description box below. And until next time, happy sewing. Bye.